Okay, so for this video, I want to touch on an interesting philosophical subject, pacifism. There's a bit of context as to why I'm making this particular video. There's a new film that's coming out called Hacksaw Ridge, directed by Mel Gibson, and it's supposedly based on the true story of Desmond Doss. Um, I should say I know nothing about this. I've literally just looked this up on Wikipedia. Who was a conscientious objector during World War II, and despite refusing to take up arms, was awarded the Medal of Honor by President Truman for gallantry during the Battle of Okinawa. Looks like an interesting war film, although there's certain scenes that are kind of heavy going. So I don't know if I'm going to get around to see it or not. That's partly why I'm making the video now. Otherwise, I'd probably be making it in the wake of the film, like after watching the film, which I may still do. The other reason is that I'm familiar with someone who's an acquaintance who is a Quaker, and he has contributed several pacifist viewpoints to several mutual forums that we are on. And he has expressed in very candid terms his pacifist views on things. Now, I'll say from the outset, I'm not a pacifist. So I should emphasize that because some people may respond to this video and think I'm speaking from a pacifist perspective. I'm not. I'm not a pacifist. Rather, I'm speaking as someone who's observing as an outsider my thoughts on this. I have something of an ambiguous view about pacifism. That is to say, it's not for me a black and white subject. I neither endorse or reject pacifists as people. Pacifism, I'm skeptical of pacifists. I've got different views on depending on the particular circumstances. Um, Firstly, I want to be clear that there are certain concepts I feel which are quite archaic now, such as cowardice, for example, at a time of war. I think that's something that it makes me uncomfortable, put it that way. I would think very, very carefully before calling another man a coward. I think it's a very loaded term, and I'm not saying I never ever say that. I mean, the circumstances I think the term is appropriate. I think bullies are cowards. I think certain terrorist acts are cowardly. I think ganging up on an individual is cowardly. So I've no problem with using the term coward in those circumstances, um, and some other circumstances. But the whole thing about cowardice and warfare, I have a big problem with because to me it just seems archaic, and it immediately makes me think of situations like, for example, during the American Civil War when there were Southerners who didn't want to fight with the Confederacy. Think of Rhett Butler during Gone with the Wind. Obviously, that's just a film, but he's kind of seen as a bit of a card among the other Confederate, the Southern gentlemen. During World War One, of course, there was the White Feather Campaign, which I've made a few videos about. It was a very high-profile campaign in which women were deliberately used to shame men who were perceived to not be fighting. Now, the irony about that was, in many cases, it wasn't even accurate anyway, because they happened to be men who were on leave, and they actually had been fighting. Um, but this is something, I think the whole concept of cowardice is something that is almost uniquely thrown at men. I think men are shamed with cowardice in a way that women aren't, at least not on the same level. Um, that's something that is uniquely thrown at men, like if you don't fight, you're a coward. World War Two, again, there was conscientious objectors who were in some cases put into internment camps or I mean, I'm yet to see this film. I don't know much about the background. I know that certainly this guy's reputation must have been restored to some extent in Alabama, where he was from. They named a highway after him, so it's not like today his name is slandered. Obviously, his reputation has been restored to some extent. Here in Britain, It's only in the last few years that there has been kind of moves to officially pardon conscientious objectors during World War One who were shot at dawn and so on. In fact, I don't know if we even have, even today, I don't know if that has fully been, I don't think there's been a full state pardon for that, which I think is dubious. Then again, it was total war, so was World War Two. So anyway, that's just a bit of my own. I want to. I think people need to be very careful before throwing out terms like cowardice because I mean, in the First World War, for example, there were young men, not just young men, men in general, who were suffering from PTSD, which of course wasn't diagnosed then; it was shell shock. They were seen to be cowards when they wouldn't go over the top, but it was because they were suffering from the neurological effects of shell shock. Um, in many cases, they were, they'd gone over the top dozens of times, and it's there's also a basic question. This notion of bravery, you have to question it. Well, it's kind of attaching this idea of being taking away the humanity, put it that way, from what is fear. Fear is a human concept. Now, that World War One mentality, especially of oh, you need to be a man, don't be frightened. It's crazy. I mean, only a fool would go over the top, going into machine guns, and not be frightened. I was watching Gettysburg the other day. I made a film review about this. I was watching Pickett's Charge. Watching the Confederates. Forget the rights and wrongs of the war for a second. I'm just talking here about the individual men. Pickett's Charge, those Confederate troops going over, 12 and a half, 13,000 of them. The courage that must have taken, going straight into Union positions where they would have been met with a barrage of fire. The same thing happened with Union troops at the Battle of Fredericksburg and with Union troops at Little Round Top. There's countless examples throughout warfare. And not just in the Western Hemisphere. I mean, the film The Flowers of War, there is one scene where the women kind of shame. This is during the Battle of Shanghai, or during the Battle of Nanjing, I should say, during World War Two. The women kind of shame this Chinese officer, like, why are you men not defending us? And it's kind of like, so this thing about this unique emphasis on men having to be the defenders is, I think it crosses cultural boundaries. It can be seen all over the world. And throughout history, there are examples of it, of the men having to be the defenders. Um, Obviously, in today's world, it's a bit different because you have examples of women in armed roles. For example, in the Peshmerga, in Kurdish culture, you have a culture of women fighters. But generally speaking, throughout history, there has been that unique emphasis on men having to be the defenders, and men who refused were either seen as cowards or traitors. And very often, women would be a big part of shaming those men for right or wrong. Okay, so that's a bit of history. I want to talk a bit more in philosophical depth with this, and this is going to be a longer video because I think the subject nature really merits that. I think when we're talking about pacifism, you have to look at it at a very, very, very basic level. I mean, I've just been given examples of war, but if we were to make it at a very basic level, because my acquaintance, he said he's opposed to violence, just outright, that's it, and that is, of course, what pacifism means. You're opposed to violence. Now, I guess my issue with pacifism is it takes all acts of violence, it takes them as a blanket situation, as all being one and the same. So that can be from warfare to an act of terrorism to one on one violence. That is, let's say, I don't know, you're going down a street and some drunk guy just assaults you for no reason. So I guess my issue with pacifism is it takes all violence as one and the same. Now, for me, that is just too simplistic because you cannot apply what might work in one situation to working in another. So, in other words, just because negotiation might work in one situation does not mean it will work in another. And I think the particular situation where this guy was debating with other people, and it was very respectful. I mean, no one was insulting the guy; they were respecting his viewpoint. But the consensus was that they were in disagreement. It was about what's just happened in France with this priest being killed by ISIS, the two ISIS operatives in Rouen, and he was kind of talking about how there should be compromise. And I mean, he wasn't. It's important to emphasize he wasn't saying they shouldn't face justice. He said they should go to prison and all the rest of it. But I think a lot of people find this hard to accept because I personally take the view when it comes to the likes of ISIS. Firstly, you need to understand that the nature of ISIS isn't like conventional terrorism. By which I mean, for example, the IRA in Northern Ireland, they were motivated by political and territorial arguments. But most IRA fighters never actually wanted to die, and they were generally not religious fanatics. They were political terrorists. They were terrorists as far as I'm concerned. I don't agree with those who say that they weren't. They murdered civilians, they were terrorists. But they were not religious terrorists. Now, when you're dealing with the likes of ISIS, you're dealing with people who actually believe they become martyrs when they die. And the cult of martyrdom is a big part of that. The same could be said for Imperial Japanese troops during World War II. When you're dealing with that death cult mentality, then I think compromise becomes very, very hard to really apply. Also, the question is, well, if you're going to go down the compromise route, in what form does it take? In what form does it take? These are questions that respectfully pacifists need to answer. Um, if you compromise with a totalitarian ideology, such as ISIS, by extension, that sort of negotiation compromise means you have to give them something that they are asking for. I mean, it defies logic. You can't have compromise without giving the other side something. That's the whole point of compromise, right? So you can't just say, oh, please lay down your arms and find the light and we'll all be friends. I think one of the problems I have with pacifism, I should say, another problem I've got with pacifism is it, on one hand, it is a noble mindset because violence is a horrible thing. And to some extent, what Gandhi said is true. An eye makes the world blind. There is some truth in that. But I think there is a profound naivety to pacifism that kind of applies this universal sweeping logic that pacifism can be used in every circumstance. I also think there's actually moral questions against pacifism. And I say that pacifism has sometimes got noble positions, but I think there's other times it is actually immoral. I mean, there is a certain irony in respecting human life to the point that you're not going to actually do anything to defend human life. And the simple fact of the matter is, in some circumstances, I mean, I would put it to pacifists if you have a situation where an armed gunman goes into a primary school, and let's say the police or the military or whoever it is that's dealing with that situation, they're armed, they have a clear shot at him, and that clear shot wouldn't endanger the children. And he is someone who has made it explicitly clear that he's going to harm those children. Can you honestly tell me that the moral position would be to do nothing and allow the very strong likelihood that he would go on then and hurt the children? Is that really a moral argument? So that's something I would push pacifists on to answer that. And there's actually a utilitarian question in this. What if killing one person saves 10 people? Now, the pacifist argument would be save the one person because violence is wrong, full stop. But then that becomes hard to justify when you end up with 11 people killed because the terrorist is going to be killed anyway by the police. but he may well take out the 10 children. That's just a loose example. Another example would be, let's say a man, right? This may sound a little old fashioned, but I happen to believe that it's a man's duty to protect his family. Um, Now, let's say you have someone who's threatening physical violence against a man's wife or children or, or girlfriend, even if it isn't a family, let's say a man is with his girlfriend. Now, morally, would it be sustainable if the couple is threatened? I don't know, by someone who's drunk or someone who wants money or whatever the situation may be. Because we live in a dangerous world and there's unpredictable people out there. That's just a fact of the world we live in. Now, let's say let's say a thug threatens or attacks a guy's girlfriend, and he is in the vicinity or he has some way to be involved in that situation. Would there really be a moral high ground in saying, well, I'm not going to physically get involved because I'm a pacifist? I struggle with that. I struggle to see any sort of moral argument in favor of that. So, in other words, would a pacifist man allow his girlfriend to be raped or murdered or beaten because he doesn't believe in violence? Now, he might say, well, you can stop the situation without violence. Really? Do you compromise with the attacker? Do you physically restrain the attacker? But what if the guy is well built? What if physical restraint isn't going to be enough to stop him? What if the guy is bigger than you, physically stronger than you? What if you've got no choice but to use a weapon to stop the guy? I don't think this is hyperbole. I think it's a very plausible situation, that it's a real world situation. So for me, the problem with pacifism is it just doesn't apply real world logic. Now, pacifists would say, well, human beings have always used violence and it's never got anywhere. There's some truth in that, but at the same time, it's not the whole picture. There have been occasions where violence have stopped a greater calamity. There have been times when police officers have had to shoot an armed suspect that has potentially created a greater violence in a particular situation. Indeed, one of the biggest and most hotly disputed subjects of all, A bombs, and I know I'm on thin territory with this one, it's a very controversial subject, but it is a classic example. It isn't just pacifists who oppose that, there's many critics of America and so on who oppose that. But here's the fundamental thing: the A bombs were arguably a necessary evil. They were evil because innocent people died, and it was a horrible event. I mean, the circumstances were utterly horrible. But it is also quite clear that at that time, Imperial Japan had a sacred war mentality, and those in power in Japan wanted the war to continue. And there's proof of that because there were Japanese soldiers still in jungles right up until the 1970s in the Indian subcontinent and so on, or Southeast Asia, I should say, who still believed the war was going on, so they still had that World War II mentality. Now, the point about the A bombs is it was a tragic and horrible event because innocent civilians died, but how many more millions would have died without them? And what irritates me a little bit is when you put that to people, they just present you as a warmonger and oh, you're an apologist for America. I'm yet to see many people actually really get into answering that question because I don't know if they can. To be quite honest, I used to be against it. I used to say, oh, that was evil. How can anyone justify it? But then I started thinking deeper and thinking, well, the fact of the matter is it ended World War II instantaneously. The very same month, Japan surrendered. It ended World War II instantly. Now, no one can be sure how many more would have died, but there's no question it would have been at the very least tens of thousands. People say Japan was on the verge of collapse anyway. I don't accept those arguments. I think that Japan was I think the mentality of the government in Tokyo was in divine sacrifice. They believed that their civilians were disposable anyway. They were determined to continue the war. That could be one of the most glaring examples, I think, of that really puts into question the pacifist argument. And the irony about that is it's been used ever since as a pacifist argument, but actually, can pacifists answer what the alternative was? And it irritates me a little bit when they say, oh, well, just don't drop the A bombs. That's the alternative. Okay, but then World War II continues. So if you're really a pacifist, what you're actually saying is that the position of having more people die is superior to the position of the people who died in the A bombs. So for me, the utilitarian argument has to be brought into every pacifist argument. It has to be what is the greater good. And there's sort of this kind of blanket position of the pacifist argument that violence is wrong, full stop. I think there's also I mean, I would never generalize pacifist people because there's variation, but there are some people who pretend to be pacifists, and yet they're violently intolerant of people they perceive to be warmongers or who don't see the world as so black and white. Let's put it that way. I'll give an example. During the recent situation regarding Syrian airstrikes, we took a decision in the British Parliament last year. There were people who were denouncing the Labour politicians who voted for the airstrikes as warmongers, yet they were violently attacking the offices of said Labour politicians to prove their point. So, if you claim to be a pacifist, then you should at least be consistent in that argument. And I do think there is an irony in the notion that you care so much about human life, yet you're not actually willing to defend it. So for me, pacifism is it's just riddled with too many contradictions. And the simplicity of it, violence is wrong, full stop, just simply doesn't take into account real world situations. I mean, the pacifist argument would be, well, violence has never worked. And I do think they definitely have some weight behind their argument because there's without question been oceans of blood spilt in human history that didn't need to be spilt. There's been dozens of feckless, unnecessary wars throughout history. So I can definitely understand why people are driven to pacifism because war is hell. And definitely there have been people who have experienced war in a way much more profound than me, who would have every right to get into the pacifist logic because they have directly experienced a hell of war and they hate war. So that makes sense. But by the same token, there have been people who have experienced a great injustice, which is equally heinous, and they would argue that the position of doing nothing is immoral. And look at World War II. I mean, there were pacifists in prison during World War II. People say that's wrong because they were conscientious objectors. But the question is, could the Third Reich have been defeated without a military option? I just don't accept that you can apply this universal logic of compromise to every situation. I don't believe you can compromise with some with totalitarian thinking. I believe that is profoundly naive, and I think it's something that pacifists cannot really answer because they apply the compromise argument to every situation. Now, how do you compromise with an ideology that wants submission and nothing else? And if you say, well, okay, well, don't compromise, just arrest them, again, that doesn't work because there's imminent situations where arrest simply doesn't work. Terrorism is a very topical issue. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn, I don't know if he's called himself a pacifist, but he's certainly taken pacifist positions. He has a problem with the shoot to kill policy. Well, if you have someone, especially given the current environment, especially given what happened in Rome, who is imminently presenting a threat, now if the police don't take action, you have again the utilitarian question of more people being killed. So I think when we take all of this into account, pacifism starts to look very, very flawed. And I want to be clear here, I am not insulting pacifists because I actually think it's quite a brave position to take. It cannot be easy to always reject violence because pacifists are human beings, like anyone. They must get angry at times, they must feel naturally hostile to what they perceive to be injustice. But I just think that pacifism as an argument starts to become very hard to justify when it goes against the utilitarian question. Now, they would say that violence only creates more violence. And there is some truth in that. But to me, it simply underestimates the power of totalitarianism. And in my opinion, you cannot compromise with totalitarianism. You just can't. Or if you did, that then immediately equates to submission. So to me, the pacifist approach to the likes of ISIS just isn't plausible. Even if Western countries don't get involved in that fight, at the very least, it needs to be held spearheaded by Arab countries. As far as I'm concerned, they need to be wiped off the face of the earth. Now, that sort of statement would shock pacifists. But my question is, how on earth do you compromise with an ideology that enslaves women, throws gay people off buildings, and slits the throats of 86-year-old priests in a church? So to me, there is also a certain degree of pontificating with pacifism, and this is another area where I find it contentious, where they present that they are holier than thou. I would say something else. If conscientious objectors in this day and age, I mean, we have in the UK, for example, we have a professional army. It's not like a conscripted army. So conscientious objectors don't have that dilemma, and they don't need to go into the armed forces, which I actually support. I don't believe people should be forced to fight in a conventional situation. If the country's invaded, that's for debate. But we have a situation where we have a professional army, so pacifists don't have to get involved. What I would say is, if you're personally a pacifist, if you're a conscientious objector, if you're a Quaker, I respect your viewpoints. But what you cannot do is then impose that onto other people and try and apply that logic and say, oh, well, no one else should have. It's a bit like sometimes there's certain Christian groups who say, turn the other cheek and forgive the person who's done that. I think it's a bit condescending and patronizing. If, let's say, my house has been trashed by burglars, or if my girlfriend has been raped, or I've suffered some other sort of great injustice, or I've witnessed some other great injustice, I'm not going to thank someone for telling me to turn the other cheek. I'd be pissed off, to be quite honest. And I would let no one I'd be pissed off. If I get assaulted by a thug in the street for no reason, if I'm minding my own business, and actually that has happened to me, and they say, oh, don't show anger, forgive them. I'd say, go and fuck yourself. I'm not going to forgive them. How condescending. So what I would say is you can apply the logic to yourself. If you believe in forgiveness, if you believe in turning the other cheek and so on, fine. And I think it takes a big degree of personal strength. I mean, I'm not saying this in a mawkish way. After, for example, the Charleston massacre in South Carolina, I think it must have taken enormous courage for the congregation of that church, as I've just seen at the Democratic National Convention, to show forgiveness to Dylan Ruth. I mean, that takes enormous inner strength. I don't think that's weakness at all. I think it's enormously strong. But what I would say is that people cannot apply that logic to others. You cannot expect others to forgive or others to. So that's why that is an area of theology that I find sometimes a bit patronizing. I don't think Christians or other religious groups should impose that sort of dogma onto other people. They can apply it to themselves, but you cannot impose that onto others. Just as others shouldn't impose their approach onto you. So no one has the right to say, "Oh, you have to use violence to defend yourself." So this has been a longer video, but I think there's been a lot of important points to look at. I'll have a few closing thoughts. I think that pacifism is an understandable ideology because the world has been drenched in violence and war and human conflict for millennia, and the vast majority of wars haven't changed a damn thing. That is true. But when pacifism makes a blanket equation of violence, saying that every situation is the same and that you can use compromise and love in every situation, I just think it is incredibly naive. And in some cases, it's downright immoral because you cannot, in certain circumstances, say that violence is not the answer or armed force is not the answer and only compromise is the answer or only showing love is the answer because in certain circumstances when you're dealing with totalitarianism, I mean, I don't want to be mawkish about this, but the idea that you simply say to ISIS, oh, please, reject violence, lay down your arms, and they'll see the light. I just think it is astonishingly naive because I think they're beyond the point of any sort of compromise other than submission. So the choice then becomes either you submit to them or you take them on. For me, anything else is appeasement. And to me, appeasement is immoral. So ultimately, I think that pacifism actually, when you analyze it, isn't always the moral high ground. Sometimes it actually only enables injustice. Okay, thank you for watching. If you are a pacifist, feel free to leave your thoughts. I respect your opinion, but all I ask is that you respect mine. So anyone who wants to call me a warmonger or whatever, yeah, that will just show that you have no argument. All you want to do is throw insults. I believe I've approached this in a reasonable manner. Um, Let me know your thoughts.